Tim was a man of simple tastes, his heart as vast and open as the skies he often painted in his spare time. His life was a canvas of predictable strokes until he met Evelyn, a woman whose smile could make flowers bloom out of season. She had a way of seeing the world that was as intricate as the lace of her favorite blouse, which she wore the day they first met. It was at a local art exhibition, her vibrant laughter echoing through the hallways like a melody that seemed to dance around every corner. Their eyes met across the room, and it was like the universe had painted a masterpiece just for them. Evelyn was drawn to Tim's gentle nature, a stark contrast to the intensity of her own spirit. His art was raw, unfiltered, and honest, much like the way he saw her. Their conversation flowed as naturally as the brushstrokes that created the very paintings that surrounded them, and soon they found themselves lost in a whirlwind of shared thoughts and dreams. Tim would bring her flowers from his mother's garden, painting her name in the sky with a softness that made her feel like the most cherished muse. They'd sit under the stars, her head resting on his chest as they whispered secrets to the night. It was a romance that seemed plucked from the pages of a classic novel, filled with sweet whispers and gentle caresses. Evelyn felt like she had found her match, a soulmate who could understand the chaotic symphony of her heart. Summary. 1. Tim, a simple and open-hearted artist, met Evelyn at an exhibition, her vibrant energy complementing his gentle nature. They connected deeply, sharing dreams and spending romantic evenings together, with Tim expressing his affection through artistic gestures like painting her name in the sky. Their relationship grew stronger with each shared sunrise and moonlit dance. They were equals in every sense, each one supporting and challenging the other to become the best version of themselves. They'd stay up all night discussing philosophy, their voices mingling with the quiet hum of the city outside. Tim's art began to take on new dimensions as Evelyn's influence seeped into his work, her fiery spirit adding a vibrant tapestry to his once monochromatic world. Their bond was unshakable, and it was clear to everyone who knew them that their hearts were forever intertwined. They decided to get married, not in a grand cathedral or a fancy hotel, but in a small, intimate ceremony in the very art gallery where they had first met. The walls were adorned with Tim's newest pieces, each one a declaration of his love for Evelyn. She walked down the aisle, her eyes never leaving his, her heart beating in time with the rhythm of their shared future. Their vows were not the traditional ones, but rather a pact of equality and partnership. They promised to stand side by side, to challenge and inspire each other, and to continue growing as individuals while their love grew stronger. The room was filled with friends and family, all of whom could see the depth of their connection. As they exchanged rings, Tim's voice was steady. "You are not just my wife, Evelyn, but my muse, my best friend, and my confidant. Together, we shall conquer the world." Summary. 1. Tim and Evelyn's deep connection grew as they shared their thoughts and passions, influencing each other. They chose a small art gallery wedding where Tim's paintings reflected his love for her. Their non-traditional vows emphasized equality and mutual growth, with Tim expressing her importance as his muse and confidant. Evelyn's response was equally heartfelt. "Tim, you are not only my husband, but the canvas on which I painted the colors of my soul. With this ring, I bind us not in ownership, but in unity, forever entwined in love and respect." The applause that followed was a celebration of their union, not just as husband and wife, but as two souls choosing to walk the path of life as equals. Their first year of marriage was a whirlwind of love and creativity. Tim's art career took off as his paintings grew more vivid and complex, reflecting the depth of their bond. Evelyn, on the other hand, flourished in her career as an art critic, her sharp eye for beauty and her sharp wit winning her accolades and recognition. They were the envy of their friends, a couple that seemed to have it all figured out, yet beneath the surface of their picture-perfect life, Evelyn harbored a secret yearning, a side of herself that she had never shared with Tim. In the quiet corners of her mind, a dominatrix was born, a side that craved power and control. It was a yearning that grew stronger with every passing day, a siren's call that whispered sweet nothings into her ear at the most unexpected moments. She would find herself daydreaming about Tim kneeling before her, her hand wrapped in his hair, guiding him to serve her every whim. Summary. 1. At their wedding, Evelyn expressed Tim as her soul's canvas in a heartfelt vow emphasizing unity and respect. Their first year was marked by professional success and a deepening bond, but Evelyn began to feel an unspoken desire for control, imagining Tim as her submissive servant in private moments. These thoughts grew more vivid with time, her fantasies taking on a life of their own. She'd imagine the art studio, not as a place of shared creation, but as a space where she could mold and shape Tim into her devoted servant. Her heart would race at the thought of his strong hands, once used to paint the strokes of love, now trembling with submission as they served her needs. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Evelyn began to assert her dominance. She started by taking over the finances, her meticulous nature making her adept at managing their shared income. It was a subtle shift, one that Tim initially welcomed as it allowed him to focus more on his art. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, he began to realize that his financial autonomy had been replaced by a strict allowance that Evelyn controlled. He felt a twinge of resentment but suppressed it, telling himself it was for the good of their marriage. Next, Evelyn began to orchestrate their social calendar. She'd invite her friends over for dinner, and Tim would find himself playing the role of the attentive host, serving them wine and engaging in conversation while Evelyn held court. He'd listen to their laughter, feeling both included and excluded at the same time, like a character in a play who had forgotten his lines. His own friends grew distant, their invitations to hang out or grab a drink slowly tapering off as Evelyn subtly made it clear that she preferred her own company. Summary: 1. Evelyn's dominance grew as she took control of their finances and social life, turning Tim into an obedient servant in their home. Despite initial reservations, Tim accepted these changes, believing it was for their marriage's benefit. Tim tried to shrug it off, telling himself that their friendship was strong enough to weather this change. Yet, the whispers in the back of his mind grew louder, questioning if this was the partnership he'd signed up for. He missed the easy camaraderie of his old life, the nights out with the guys, the simple joy of a shared beer and a hearty laugh. But when he tried to bring it up with Evelyn, her eyes would flash with something he hadn't seen before, a spark of defiance that seemed to dare him to challenge her. He learned to swallow his words, to nod along to her plans, to agree with every decision she made. It was easier than fighting, easier than facing the storm that seemed to brew whenever he dared to voice his own desires. The art that once flowed from his heart now felt forced, the strokes of his brush echoing the unspoken tension in their home. The vibrant colors of their love grew muted under the shadow of Evelyn's newfound dominance. Tim's days became a series of routines, a dance of submission that he performed to keep the peace. He'd wake up early to make her breakfast, his movements precise and calculated, ensuring every detail was just as she liked it. The eggs were always perfectly scrambled, the toast a perfect shade of golden brown. He'd lay out her clothes for the day, folded neatly, the creases sharp as the lines in her lips when she was displeased. Summary: 1. Tim's resentment grew as Evelyn's control expanded to their social life, causing his art to suffer. Despite his efforts to maintain a peaceful marriage, he felt his identity slipping away in the face of Evelyn's dominance. Summary: 2. Tim and Evelyn met at an exhibition and bonded over shared passions, leading to a unique wedding with non-traditional vows promising equality. However, Evelyn's desire for control grew, influencing their marriage dynamics. She gradually dominated their home life, taking over finances and social decisions, causing Tim to feel like a servant. Despite his love, Tim's art and identity suffered as he became increasingly submissive to Evelyn. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Evelyn called him into the living room. She was lounging on the couch, her feet up on the coffee table, the remnants of her day's work scattered around her. She looked at him, her eyes gleaming with something that made his stomach knot. "Darling," she said, her voice a soft purr, "could you give me a foot massage? I've had the most tiring day." Tim set down his brushes and palette, his heart sinking slightly. He knew he should be happy to pamper her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this request than just tired feet. He approached her, his steps measured, and took a seat on the floor before her. His hands, once so adept at capturing the essence of life on canvas, now trembled slightly as he took her delicate feet into his grasp. He began to massage her arches, his thumbs pressing into the taut muscles with all the care of a sculptor. Evelyn's smile grew wider as she watched him, her eyes gleaming with a mischievous spark. "You know, Tim," she began, her voice as smooth as velvet, "I feel so much more relaxed when you're closer to the ground." She gestured for him to kneel before her, and with a silent nod, he complied. Her bare feet now rested on his shoulders, her toes wiggling slightly as she leaned back into the plush cushions. Summary 1. Evelyn began to demand personal services from Tim, starting with a foot massage, which she used to assert more control, making him kneel before her and highlighting their shift in power dynamics. Tim's hands paused for a moment, the air thick with a tension that was palpable. He looked up at her, his eyes questioning, but she just returned his gaze with a soft, knowing smile. "Kiss them," she whispered, and it was as if the room had been drenched in honey, slowing down every movement and sound. He leaned in, his breath hot against her skin, and gently pressed his lips to her toes. The act was both foreign and exhilarating, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their dynamic. Evelyn's eyes closed, and she let out a soft sigh, her smile deepening. She hummed, "just like that." Tim's mind raced as he continued the massage, his lips kissing a path along her instep, his thumbs working the tension from her heels. He couldn't believe he was doing this, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of something. Was it love? Submission? Or was it the beginnings of fear? He didn't know, but he knew he didn't want to stop. The power she wielded over him was intoxicating, a thrill that sent a shiver down his spine. That's good," Evelyn murmured, her eyes still closed. "But I think they need something more intimate." She slid her feet down his cheeks until her toes were just millimeters from his mouth. "Lick them," she ordered, her voice a silken whip. Summary 1. During a foot massage, Evelyn escalated her dominance by making Tim kiss and lick her feet, revealing a new intimate power dynamic that both disturbed and thrilled him. Tim's heart hammered in his chest as he looked up at her, unsure of what to do next. But the look in her eyes was unmistakable, she was in charge now. He leaned in tentatively, his tongue darting out to graze the delicate skin of her foot. It tasted faintly of her favorite lavender lotion, and the softness was a stark contrast to the firmness of her arch. Yes," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open to watch him. Her feet were elegant, with slender toes that curled slightly as she felt his hot breath against her skin. She wiggled them slightly, enjoying the sensation as he licked and kissed his way along her foot, his movements becoming more eager with every passing second. "Just like that," she encouraged, her voice a low purr of satisfaction. Tim felt a mix of confusion and arousal as he continued to obey, his mind racing with the implications of this new dynamic. He'd never been one to crave submission, but here he was, on his knees, serving his wife in a way he never thought possible. The following week saw Evelyn's dominance grow more pronounced. She'd come home from work and immediately ordered Tim to prepare her a bath, the water just the right temperature, with a sprinkle of her favorite salts and a chilled glass of wine waiting on the side. He'd watch her slip into the tub, her body relaxing in the steamy water, and feel a strange thrill at the sight of her so utterly at ease because of his efforts. Summary 1. Evelyn's dominance escalated with Tim licking her feet, leading to her giving him more servile tasks such as preparing her bath, reinforcing their new power dynamic and causing Tim to grapple with his feelings of submission and arousal. Dinner became an elaborate affair, with Tim cooking meals that catered to her every whim. He'd spend hours in the kitchen, chopping, sautéing, and seasoning, his mind focused solely on her satisfaction. When it was time to serve, he'd do so with a flourish, presenting the plates to her as if they were offerings to a queen. She'd often sit at the head of the table, her bare feet resting on his thighs as he knelt beside her, ready to refill her wine glass or fetch any forgotten condiment. Their intimate moments grew more intense, her desires guiding every touch and caress. She'd instruct him on how she wanted to be pleasured, his hands and mouth moving in sync with her every command. He'd watch her face contort with pleasure, her eyes glazing over as she reached climax, and he'd feel a strange sense of pride knowing he'd been the one to elicit such a reaction. His own needs took a back seat, his pleasure secondary to hers. Yet, he found a certain satisfaction in her cries of ecstasy, a validation of his newfound role as her devoted servant. One evening, as Tim knelt before Evelyn, worshipping her feet, she decided the time had come to push the boundaries further. "You're so eager," she teased, her toes curling slightly as she felt his hot breath against them. "But sometimes, you need to be reminded who's in charge." Summary 1. Tim's servitude extended to cooking elaborate dinners and serving Evelyn at the table with his feet, becoming a regular part of their routine. Their intimate life became more intense with Evelyn guiding Tim's every move, reinforcing her dominance, and finding his role as her servant increasingly satisfying. With a swift, deliberate motion, she pulled her foot away, just as Tim was about to kiss her arch. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Evelyn's smile was cold and calculated. "You bit me," she accused, her voice as sharp as a slap. "You know how much I hate that." Tim's eyes widened in shock, his mouth still hovering over her foot. I didn't mean to," he stuttered, his cheeks flushing. He hadn't felt his teeth graze her skin, but the sudden jerk of her foot was undeniable. Evelyn's smile grew colder. "Didn't mean to, or didn't care?" she asked, her voice a whip crack of accusation. Tim's heart raced, the sudden shift in her tone sending a jolt of fear through him. "I care," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what happened." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her hand coming down with a sharp crack against his cheek. The sound echoed through the room, a stark contrast to the gentle strokes of his paintbrush. "You don't know what happened," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Well, let me make it clear for you." Tim's head snapped to the side with the force of the slap, his eyes watering from the sudden sting. He brought a hand to his face, his cheek burning with both pain and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Summary. 1. During a foot-worshipping session, Evelyn accused Tim of biting her and slapped him, establishing a clear dominance and making him apologize profusely, leaving him shaken and more aware of his submissive role. "Sorry isn't good enough," Evelyn said, her voice a frosty whisper. She leaned back into the couch, her gaze unyielding. "You need to be taught a lesson." Tim felt a mix of dread and arousal coil in his stomach, unsure of what was to come but unable to deny the thrill of her dominance. She slapped him again, her hand leaving a hot imprint on his other cheek. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room, and Tim's breath hitched in his chest. "Lie down," she ordered, and he did, his body obeying even as his mind reeled from the shock of it all. He stretched out on the cold, hardwood floor, his eyes never leaving hers. She stood up, her body lithe and powerful as she approached him, her bare feet stepping onto his chest. He could feel the weight of her, pressing down on his ribs, the softness of her soles against his skin. "You're mine," she whispered, her voice a seductive hiss that sent a shiver down his spine. "Every inch of you belongs to me, to do with as I please." She took another step, her foot coming to rest on his throat. He could feel the warmth of her, the power in her every movement. "Do you understand?" she demanded. Tim nodded frantically, his breath coming in short gasps as her weight pressed down on his windpipe. He could see the excitement in her eyes, the thrill of her newfound power reflected in the gleaming surface of her high heels. "Yes," he choked out, his voice barely a croak. Summary. 1. Evelyn continued her dominance with a second slap and ordered Tim to lie down, placing her feet on his chest and then his throat, reinforcing her ownership over him and his complete submission to her will, leaving him both scared and excited by this extreme power play. Summary. 2. Evelyn introduced a new level of dominance, starting with Tim massaging her feet, which evolved into kissing and licking them. She began assigning him more servile tasks such as preparing her bath and serving her dinner. Their intimate life intensified with Evelyn guiding Tim's every move, culminating in a foot-worshipping session where she slapped him for supposedly biting her. This incident reinforced her control and Tim's submissiveness, with her placing her feet on his throat, leaving him fearful yet aroused by his new role. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice a mix of satisfaction and mockery. She lifted her foot from his neck, giving him a brief moment to gulp in a lungful of air before placing it back down, this time on his face, pressing his cheek into the cold, hard floor. Her heel dug into the soft skin under his eye, and Tim couldn't help but whimper. "You'll learn to be more careful," she said, her tone almost affectionate. "Now, apologize properly." Tim's voice was muffled against the floor, but he managed to murmur, "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I didn't mean to disappoint you." Evelyn's eyes flashed with a dark amusement. "Disappoint me?" she echoed, her voice a taunt. "You're my husband, not my servant." But it seems you need a reminder of your place. With that, she lifted her foot and brought it down again, her bare heel landing squarely on his chest. He gasped for air, his body trembling beneath her. "Evelyn," he rasped, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. But she was lost in the thrill of her power, her smile a twisted parody of the love they had once shared. She stepped off of him and grabbed his wrists, pulling him to his feet. "On your back," she ordered, her voice as cold as ice. "I'll show you how a real man serves his woman." Summary 1. Tim struggles with the severity of Evelyn's control, but her affectionate mockery and subsequent violent act of stepping on his chest drives home the message of his new servitude. She commands him to lie on his back, escalating their power dynamic and hinting at further degradation in their evolving relationship. With trembling hands, Tim did as he was told, lying flat on the floor as she stood over him. He watched as she placed one foot on his chest, the arch high and proud, the toes pointed like a ballet dancer's. Then, with a cruel smile, she brought the other down, her heel pressing into the soft flesh of his stomach. He gasped, the pain sharp and sudden, but he didn't dare protest. "You're mine to command," she whispered, her voice a dark caress. "Mine to use." She brought her heel down again, this time aiming for his groin. Tim's eyes watered, and he couldn't hold back a whimper as she ground her foot into his sensitive flesh. "Mine," she said again, her voice a possessive purr that sent a shiver of fear down his spine. "Evelyn," he choked out, his voice a plea. But she was in control now, her eyes alight with a power that both terrified and thrilled him. She leaned down, her breath hot against his ear. "Do you understand?" she whispered. "Do you understand who you belong to?" He nodded again, his eyes never leaving hers. She stepped off of him, her bare feet cold against the floorboards as she circled him like a predator. "Say it," she demanded. "Say it out loud." Tim swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I belong to you, Evelyn." Summary 1. Evelyn asserts her dominance by placing her heels on Tim's body, inflicting pain and degradation. Tim's repeated apologies and affirmations of her ownership only fuel her desire to control him further, leaving him lying on the floor, utterly submissive and acknowledging his enslavement to her. Evelyn's smile was as cold as the marble statue that stood in the corner of their living room. "Good," she purred, her eyes gleaming with a triumphant fire. "Now, let's see how well you can serve me." With a graceful step, she straddled his chest, her bare feet planted firmly on either side of his head. The sensation of her cool skin against his burning cheeks was jarring, a stark reminder of the power she wielded. "From now on," she began, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper, "you will address me as your goddess. Understood?" Tim nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its implications. "Yes, goddess," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. Evelyn's smile grew, a predatory glint in her eye. "That's better," she said, her voice a soft caress that seemed to stroke the very soul of his submission. She leaned down, her breath warm against his face. "You're learning," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Now, I want you to say it again. And this time, I want to hear the conviction in your voice." Tim took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling beneath her. "Yes, goddess," he said, his voice stronger this time. The word felt foreign on his tongue, a title that seemed to hold the power to either destroy or elevate him. Summary 1. Evelyn straddles Tim, reinforcing her dominance and demanding to be addressed as a goddess. Despite the fear and awe, Tim obeys and addresses her with the new title, signaling his complete surrender to her power and the transformation of their marriage into a master-slave relationship. "On your knees," Evelyn ordered, her voice a sultry command that sent a jolt of electricity through his body. He complied without hesitation, his legs folding beneath him until he was kneeling at her feet. She stepped closer, her bare toes curling around his neck like a delicate necklace. "Now, show me how much you love me," she purred, lifting one foot so that it hovered just in front of his face. "Open your mouth." Tim did as he was told, his heart racing as the scent of her skin filled his nose. She placed her foot against his parted lips, and he felt the softness of her arch against his teeth. "Gag on my foot," she whispered, a hint of malice in her tone. Tim's eyes widened, but he obeyed, his mouth stretching around her foot as he tried to take in as much of her as he could. He could feel the muscles in his throat working, the gag reflex rising and falling as she pushed further into his mouth. Her toes brushed against the back of his throat, and he had to fight not to choke. "Deeper," she urged, her voice a siren's call that he couldn't resist. Tim's eyes watered as he took more of her foot, her heel pushing against his tongue. He could taste the sweetness of her lotion and the faint metallic tang of her skin. Her toes curled, and he knew she was watching him, enjoying every moment of his struggle. "Good," she murmured, her voice a warm caress that seemed to stroke his soul. "That's what a good slave does." Summary 1. Tim kneels at Evelyn's feet, and she instructs him to gag on her foot, pushing it deep into his mouth. Despite his discomfort, he obeys, and she praises his subservience, reinforcing his role as her devoted slave and her satisfaction with his willingness to endure for her pleasure. Summary 2. Tim is forced into an extreme act of submission, with Evelyn stepping on his chest and demanding he lie on the floor. She commands him to gag on her foot, which he does despite his fear. This act solidifies their new master-slave relationship, with Tim addressing her as a goddess and accepting his enslavement to her, performing degrading tasks like gagging on her foot to satisfy her desires. Summary 3. Tim and Evelyn's marriage, which started with a promise of equality, morphs into a master-slave relationship with Evelyn dominating Tim. She takes over financial decisions and social life, making him perform servile tasks like foot massages and dinner service. Their intimacy escalates with Evelyn's foot worship, culminating in Tim being slapped and forced into a submissive act that leaves him fearful yet aroused. This power shift becomes more pronounced when she steps on his throat and commands him to gag on her foot, which he does, accepting his new role. The days that followed were a blur of servitude and humiliation. Each morning, Tim would wake to the sound of Evelyn's voice, her commands echoing through the house like a symphony of his submission. He'd start his day by making her breakfast, serving it to her in bed as she lounged among the tangled sheets. The smell of coffee and eggs would mingle with the scent of her perfume, a heady mix that made him feel both nauseous and aroused. He'd kneel by the bedside, his eyes downcast as she took her first sip of tea, her pinky raised in a gesture of aristocratic elegance. She'd murmur, her voice still thick with sleep. "You're improving." It was the closest thing to praise he received, and it was like a drug, making his heart race and his body ache to please her further. He'd wait, his knees aching, until she'd finished every last bite before being granted permission to leave. "Make sure to clean up," she'd say, her voice dripping with the sweetness of a toxic nectar. As the days rolled into weeks, the humiliation grew more intense. "You're going to wear this," Evelyn declared one evening, holding up a pair of women's lacy panties. Tim's cheeks burned as he took them from her, his hands trembling. "And don't bother with anything else," she added with a wicked smile. "I want you to feel the fabric against your skin, to be reminded of your place at all times." Summary 1. Tim's life becomes a routine of serving Evelyn's every need, receiving minimal praise and experiencing intense humiliation. He is now required to wear women's underwear as a constant reminder of his new status as her slave. The dynamic deepens, with Evelyn's cruel smile indicating her enjoyment of his suffering and his ongoing descent into complete submission. Tim's eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Why yes, goddess," he stammered, his voice barely audible. He slipped the panties on, the fabric clinging to him in a way that felt both wrong and exhilarating. The lace was itchy and uncomfortable, a constant reminder of his new role. "Perfect," Evelyn said, her eyes raking over him with a predatory gaze. She stepped closer, her bare toes pressing into his chest. "Now, let's see how well you can serve me today." She reached down and grabbed a handful of his hair, pulling his face closer to her. "Kiss my feet," she ordered, her voice a seductive whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Tim leaned in, his cheek brushing against the soft skin of her ankle, and placed a gentle kiss on the top of her foot. She let out a sigh of pleasure, her grip on his hair tightening. "Like you mean it," she hissed, and he did, pressing his lips to her toes with a fervor that surprised even him. With a smug smile, Evelyn pulled away and disappeared into the bedroom. Tim heard the rustle of fabric and the clink of her jewelry box opening. His heart raced as he wondered what she had in store for him next. When she emerged, she held a leather collar in her hand, the metal studs gleaming in the lamplight. She approached him, her hips swaying with a newfound confidence. Summary 1. Tim continues to submit to Evelyn, wearing women's underwear and receiving her commands. She grabs his hair and makes him kiss her feet, which he does with surprising enthusiasm. Afterward, she reveals a leather collar with studs, hinting at further degradation and control in their relationship, leaving Tim anticipating the next stage of his enslavement. "Put this on," she ordered, her voice a soft purr of dominance. Tim's hands trembled as he took the collar, the smell of leather filling his nostrils. He fastened it around his neck, the cool metal pressing into his skin like a brand. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. Evelyn's smile was cold and triumphant as she stepped closer, her naked body a stark contrast to his pathetic state. She lowered herself onto his face, her thighs trapping him as she sat on his head. He could feel the heat of her, the dampness of her sex as she ground down, her pussy smothering his nose and mouth. "Breathe through your nose," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "You need to get used to it." Tim's world narrowed to the scent of her arousal and the pressure building in his lungs. He struggled to inhale, his nose buried in the softness of her flesh. His eyes watered, and he could feel the beginnings of panic as she rocked her hips, her clit rubbing against his cheeks. That's it," she moaned, her voice a siren's call that seemed to fill the room. "You're doing so well, my little slave." Summary 1. Tim is now made to wear a studded leather collar, symbolizing his ownership. Evelyn sits on his face, forcing him to become accustomed to her scent and the sensation of her skin on his nose and mouth, pushing his boundaries of submission and reinforcing her dominance. She praises his compliance, which fuels his fear and desire. Her words sent a jolt through his body, his cock straining against the fabric of the panties. He didn't know how much more of this he could take, his mouth and nose buried in her sex, her weight pressing down on his face like a living, breathing vice. He could feel her growing wetter, her juices coating his cheeks and chin. "Lick me," she ordered, her voice a harsh whisper. "Lick me until I come." Tim's tongue darted out, tentative at first, but her grip on his hair tightened, urging him on. He tasted the musky sweetness of her, the salty tang of her desire, and something within him snapped. He lapped at her eagerly, his tongue darting and swirling as he sought out her clit, her taste an addictive elixir that fueled his submission. He could hear the wet sounds of his tongue against her flesh, muffled by the fabric of the panties he was forced to wear. "That's it," Evelyn breathed, her nails digging into his scalp. "Good boy." The words were a balm to his soul, a validation that he was pleasing her. He felt her tense, her thighs squeezing his head as she approached climax. He redoubled his efforts, his tongue moving faster, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps through his nose. Summary 1. Tim's servitude escalates as Evelyn commands him to lick her until she reaches orgasm, his tongue exploring her body while he wears women's panties. Her praise, calling him a good boy, reinforces his submission and desire to serve her, making him push past his own discomfort to satisfy her needs. Summary 2. Tim's servitude intensifies, with Evelyn making him wear women's underwear and a studded collar, constant reminders of his enslavement. She orders him to kiss her feet and lick her until she climaxes, pushing his boundaries. Her praise, addressing him as a good boy, solidifies his submission and his willingness to endure humiliation for her pleasure, fully embracing his role as her devoted slave in this twisted power dynamic. As she came, her body spasming against his face, Tim felt a strange sense of euphoria wash over him. He was her servant, her slave, and the fact that he could give her such pleasure was intoxicating. He waited, his tongue still working, until she leaned back with a satisfied sigh, her weight lifting from his face. He took a deep, shaky breath, his cheeks sticky with her juices. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice a soft command that he obeyed without thought. She held up a mirror, her reflection looking down at him with a smug smile. "See what you've become," she said, her eyes gleaming with triumph. In the reflection, he saw a man with a bruised face, wearing women's underwear, collared like a pet. But it was the hunger in his eyes that truly terrified him. "You're mine," she murmured, her fingers tracing the leather around his neck. "Mine to use, mine to control." She leaned down, her breasts brushing against his cheek as she whispered in his ear, "And if you're a good boy, I'll let you breathe." With a cruel laugh, she straddled his face, her pussy hovering just above his nose and mouth. Summary. 1. Tim reaches a new high of submission during Evelyn's climax, finding pleasure in her satisfaction. She shows him his reflection in a mirror, revealing his bruised and feminized state, which both scares and excites him. She reasserts her ownership, promising to let him breathe only if he continues to serve her well, reinforcing his role as her subservient slave. "Open your mouth," she demanded, her voice a siren's call that he couldn't resist. He obeyed, his eyes watering as she lowered herself onto him. He could feel the heat of her, the smell of her arousal filling his nostrils as she began to grind her hips, pressing down on his face. "Wider," she ordered, her nails digging into his scalp, and he did as he was told, his mouth stretching around her sex, her thighs clamped down on his cheeks, trapping him as she began to move in earnest. The fabric of the panties grew wetter, sticking to his face, as he struggled to breathe. He could feel her swelling against his tongue, the taste of her growing stronger, more intoxicating with every passing second. "That's it," she murmured, her voice a dark purr. "Such a good little slut." Tim's eyes watered, his throat burning, but he didn't dare protest. This was his penance for biting her, for ever thinking that he was her equal. He was her slave, her toy, and she would do with him as she willed. Her hips began to rock faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she approached climax. "Don't stop," she breathed, her voice tight with desire. The fabric of the panties grew damp with her juices, clinging to his skin as she ground down on his face. He could feel the pressure building, the need for air growing more desperate by the second. But he knew better than to disobey. He lapped at her, his tongue moving in a desperate dance as she grew wetter, her cries of pleasure echoing in his ears. Summary. 1. Tim's submission deepens as Evelyn forces him to perform an intense oral act while wearing panties, his ability to breathe restricted. She calls him a good little slut, reinforcing his degradation. He accepts his punishment, understanding his role as her obedient servant, pushing through his discomfort to satisfy her sexual needs, and eagerly awaiting her climax. Yes," she moaned, her grip on his hair tightening. "You're doing such a good job, my sweet little whore." Her voice was a sweet agony, a reminder of his subjugation. He felt the pressure in his chest, his lungs screaming for oxygen, but he didn't dare stop. He could feel her body tense, her thighs gripping his cheeks as she rode his face with increasing urgency. "I'm going to come," she warned, her voice a low growl. "And when I do, I expect you to swallow it all." Tim nodded, his eyes squeezed shut, the fabric of the panties sticking to his face. The pressure grew unbearable, stars dancing at the edges of his vision. He could feel the muscles in his neck straining, his body begging for relief, but he pushed through it, his tongue flicking against her clit. "Good boy," Evelyn murmured, her voice a warm caress that seemed to fill every corner of his soul. "Take it all, my little bitch." Tim's cheeks hollowed as he sucked, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps through his nose. The collar grew tighter, the leather digging into his neck as she leaned back, her weight pressing down on his face. Summary. 1. Evelyn continues her verbal degradation, calling Tim a whore and ordering him to swallow everything. His physical distress grows as he struggles to breathe and obey her commands. Despite his desperation, he pushes through, eagerly satisfying her until she reaches orgasm. Her praise, "good boy," reinforces his enslavement, with her weight and the collar symbolizing her power over him. Suddenly, she slapped him, hard. The sound echoed through the room, and Tim's eyes snapped open in shock. He could feel blood trickling from his nose, the coppery taste mixing with the sweetness of her arousal. "Look at me," she ordered, her voice a whip crack. He obeyed, his eyes locking with hers in the mirror. The malicious glee in her gaze was like a knife to his heart, but it only served to make him want to please her more. Without warning, she shoved her foot into his open mouth, the arch of her bare soul pressing against his throat so forcefully that he couldn't help but gag. He felt the fabric of the panties pull taut against his face as she pushed harder, her toes digging into the back of his throat. "Swallow," she demanded, her voice cold and unyielding. He tried, his throat muscles working to accommodate her, but it was too much. A strangled sound escaped him, and she leaned back, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she watched him struggle for air. He coughed, his eyes watering as a trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth, staining the pristine white fabric. "You see," she said, her voice a low, dark purr. "This is what happens when you disappoint me." Tim nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and arousal, his cheeks flushed from the lack of oxygen. The metallic taste of blood coated his tongue, and he swallowed it back, the coppery flavor a stark reminder of his subjugation. "Good boy," Evelyn cooed, her voice a sweet poison that flowed through his veins. She slid her foot out of his mouth, and he gasped for air, his chest heaving. She stepped away from him, watching as he coughed and wheezed on the floor, blood spattering onto the plush carpet beneath her. "I want to see more," she whispered, her eyes alight with a sadistic glee. "I want you to crave the taste of your own blood when you serve me." Tim looked up at her, his eyes glazed with a mix of pain and obedience. He knew better than to argue or resist. With a wicked smirk, Evelyn raised her other foot, the bright red polish gleaming in the soft lamplight. She placed it against his chest, her toes curling as she pushed him back down onto the floor. He felt the weight of her body, the power she had over him, and it was intoxicating. He closed his eyes, bracing for the pain. "Look at me," she demanded, her voice a seductive whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. He forced his eyes open, meeting her gaze in the mirror. Her eyes were alight with a dark hunger, her pupils dilated with desire. "Now," she said, her voice a coil of silk around his throat, "I want you to apologize for every time you've ever thought of defying me." Tim's throat constricted around her foot, his voice a desperate croak as he tried to form words. I am sorry, goddess," he managed, his tongue thick with the taste of blood and fear. "I'm so sorry." Evelyn's smile was a cold, cruel thing as she leaned over him, her eyes gleaming with sadistic satisfaction. She spat on her foot, the saliva landing with a wet splat on her toes. "Clean it," she ordered, her voice a sultry whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Tim's stomach turned, but he didn't dare refuse. He leaned in, his tongue tentatively touching the salty wetness that marred the perfection of her skin. The taste was bitter, but he lapped at it eagerly, his eyes never leaving hers in the mirror. Her expression grew more smug with every swipe of his tongue, watching as he licked and sucked until her foot was pristine once more. "Good boy," she purred, her voice a dark symphony of power and pleasure. "Now, get in your cage." Tim crawled to the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving hers as he obediently climbed into the small metal enclosure. She had bought it online, a pet cage, and had placed it in their bedroom. It was a stark reminder of his new status in their marriage, a symbol of his complete and utter submission. The cold bars bit into his skin as he curled into a ball, his body trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "Close your eyes," Evelyn ordered, her voice a sweet symphony of control. He complied, his breath coming in short gasps as he felt her approach. The cage door clanked shut, the finality of it resonating through the room like a gunshot. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and pleasure, a twisted dance of dominance and submission that Tim couldn't escape. His nights were spent in the cage, the cold metal bars a stark contrast to the warmth of their marriage bed. During the day, he was her devoted servant, carrying out every task she demanded with unwavering dedication. The house gleamed with his effort, a testament to his new role. Evelyn had grown more brazen with her control, her desires evolving and growing with each passing day. She'd often come home from work, her heels clacking against the tiles as she called out his name, her voice a siren's song that sent a shiver of anticipation down his spine. He'd drop whatever he was doing and scurry to her side, eager to serve, his heart pounding in his chest. Tim's days were now a never-ending cycle of chores and degradation. He'd start with the laundry, feeling the softness of her underwear against his hands as he folded them neatly, placing them in her drawer just so. Then it was on to the dishes, scrubbing away at the residue of their meals, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts about how she'd used him the night before. The cage was his sanctuary at night, the cold metal bars a constant reminder of his place. But even in the confines of his prison, he felt a perverse sense of comfort, of belonging. The sight of her high heels approaching was his signal to drop to his knees. He'd watch in the mirror as she'd place one foot on the edge of the cage, her toes teasing his mouth. "You know what to do," she'd say, her voice a sweet symphony of power and pleasure. And he did. He'd eagerly take her foot in his mouth, his tongue worshipping every inch, from her toes to her heel. She'd often leave it there, his mouth open, his breathing muffled, while she went about her evening routine. The weeks that followed were a blur of mundane tasks and moments of intense, degrading pleasure. Tim's days were filled with cooking, cleaning, and running errands, all while dressed in the frilly aprons and lingerie she'd deemed appropriate for his new station. The nights were spent in his cage, the cold bars pressing into his skin as he listened to the soft sounds of her sleeping form above him. The only time he'd leave the cage was to use the bathroom, and even then, he had to ask for permission, his voice a soft, obedient whisper in the dark. Evelyn reveled in her newfound power, her eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction every time she looked at him. She knew she owned him, body and soul. Every time he called her goddess, every time he obeyed without question, it was like a sweet nectar that filled her with strength. She'd strut around the house, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors, knowing that with a single word, she could reduce him to a trembling, begging mess at her feet. Tim's transformation into a sex slave was complete. His days were filled with menial tasks, serving her every whim and desire. He'd clean the house, cook her meals, and run her bath, all while dressed in the skimpiest lingerie she could find, his manhood on full display for her amusement. She'd watch him work, a smug smile playing on her lips as she lounged on the couch, her feet propped up on his back as a makeshift footrest. The nights were a symphony of pleasure and pain, a masquerade ball where she was the queen and he, the entertainment. She'd summon him with a snap of her fingers, his collar tightening around his neck as he stumbled out of his cage, his eyes glazed with a mix of fear and longing. She'd lead him to the bedroom, his wrists bound with velvet ribbons, his ankles shackled with steel. He'd lie there, naked and exposed, as she picked out her favorite toys, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Spread your legs," she'd command, her voice a sweet poison that he couldn't resist. He'd do as he was told, his cock hardening despite the fear that coiled in his stomach. She'd trace her fingers along his body, her nails leaving little trails of fire in their wake. She knew every inch of him, every sensitive spot that made him squirm and beg. And she used that knowledge to her full advantage, teasing and tormenting him until he was a trembling mess beneath her. Evelyn would then choose her weapon of pleasure, a smirk playing on her lips as she decided how best to claim her property. Sometimes it was a feather, lightly tickling his skin, making him jerk and twitch. Other times, it was a paddle, the smack of leather echoing through the room as it collided with his flesh, leaving him gasping for breath. But always, it ended with her taking him, using his body to satisfy her darkest cravings. Tim's existence had been whittled down to this, a living doll for Evelyn to manipulate and control. Yet, amidst the pain and humiliation, he found a strange comfort in his servitude. Her pleasure was his sole purpose, and when she finally allowed him release, it was like a divine gift from above, a brief moment of respite from his endless cycle of obedience. One evening, as Tim knelt before her, his eyes fixed on the gleaming red polish of her toes, Evelyn decided it was time to introduce a new element to their twisted game. She stepped out of her heels, her bare feet landing with a soft thud on the plush carpet. She approached him, her movements deliberate and predatory, the scent of her desire hanging heavy in the air. "Tonight," she murmured, "you will experience the true depth of your servitude." Her words sent a tremor of fear and excitement through him, his cock pulsing with anticipation. He'd done his best to hide his arousal, to be the obedient servant she demanded, but it was impossible. Every act of submission, every moment of degradation, only served to fuel his need for more. He waited, his heart racing, as she picked up a set of handcuffs from the bedside table. The metal was cold against his wrists as she snapped them into place, the sound echoing through the room like a promise of things to come. "You're mine," she murmured, her breath hot against his ear. "And tonight, I'm going to remind you just how much." Tim felt his heart race, his body responding to her words despite the fear that coiled in his belly. He knew what was expected of him, knew the price of failing to please her. But as she stepped away, leaving him kneeling and bound before her, he couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. This was his purpose now, to be used by her, to satisfy her every whim. Evelyn walked around the room, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she surveyed her collection of toys and devices. Tim watched her, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his cock straining against the fabric of the lingerie she'd forced him to wear. He knew that she would choose something special for tonight, something that would push him to the very edge of his endurance. Finally, she settled on a long, slender object, a wicked glint in her eye as she turned to face him. "This," she said, holding up the dildo, "will be your new best friend." She approached him, the leather of her stiletto heels whispering against the carpet as she moved. She knelt beside him, her hand brushing against his cheek as she held the toy up for his inspection. "Open your mouth," she ordered, her voice a low purr that sent shivers down his spine. Tim obeyed without hesitation, his jaw dropping open as she slid the cold, rubbery shaft between his lips. He could taste the faint scent of latex, feel the weight of it in his mouth. She held his gaze in the mirror, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she pushed it deeper, forcing his throat to stretch around its girth. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice a sweet symphony of satisfaction. "Now, you're going to learn to love it like I love your cock." With a flick of her wrist, she turned on the vibrator, the low buzz filling the room. Tim's eyes watered as she began to move it in and out, his throat tightening around the intrusion. The sensation was alien, uncomfortable, but he didn't dare resist. His body was hers to use, her plaything to manipulate. Evelyn watched his face in the mirror, a smug smile playing on her lips as she worked the toy deeper into his mouth. His eyes grew wider, his cheeks flushing a dark red as he gagged around it. "That's it," she cooed, her voice a dark, sweet symphony of pleasure. "Take it all, my little slut." The vibrations grew stronger, the dildo buzzing in his throat as she began to move it with more vigor. He choked, his eyes watering, but she didn't stop. She loved the sound, the way he struggled to breathe around it, the way his body responded despite the fear. It was a testament to her power, to her ability to mold him into whatever she desired. Evelyn leaned back, watching as Tim's body tensed with each thrust, his eyes never leaving hers in the mirror. She could see the desperation in them, the need for release, but she wasn't ready to give it to him yet. No, she wanted him to crave it, to beg for it. She slid the dildo out of his mouth, the wetness of his saliva glistening on the shaft. "You're doing so well," she said, her voice a sweet caress. "But I think we need to take things up a notch." Tim's eyes widened in terror and anticipation as she picked up a bottle of lubricant, the clear liquid shimmering in the low light. She coated the dildo, the squelching sound filling the air as she worked it into the toy. "You're going to take this," she said, her voice firm, "and you're going to love it." He felt his body tremble, his mind racing as she approached him, the toy held high. She bent down, her breasts pressing against his cheek as she whispered, "You're going to be my little bitch, Tim. My toy to play with whenever I want." The words sent a shockwave of arousal through him, and he closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. With a cruel twist of her wrist, she slammed the dildo into his mouth, the vibrations sending jolts of pleasure through his body. He gagged, his eyes watering, as she forced him to deep-throat the intrusive object. He could feel the head of it hitting the back of his throat, the sensation overwhelming and terrifying. Yet, amidst the fear, there was something else, something dark and twisted that made his cock throb. Tim's mind raced as Evelyn continued her relentless assault, her hand pumping the dildo in and out of his throat with a fervor that left him breathless. He knew he was hers, that his body was a mere vessel for her pleasure. It was a heady realization, one that filled him with a mix of dread and exhilaration. His own desires had been buried so deep, but now, they were bubbling to the surface, a potent cocktail of pain and pleasure that he couldn't resist. Evelyn's eyes never left the mirror, watching as his face contorted around the toy, his eyes pleading for mercy and release. She knew just how much he could take, pushing him to his limits before finally pulling back, allowing him a gasp of air. She felt like a goddess, her power over him absolute and intoxicating. Tim's body was a canvas of her desire, a sculpture of submission she had crafted with meticulous care. His cries of protest were music to her ears, each one a sweet symphony of surrender. He was no longer a man but a sex slave, an object to be used and discarded when she'd had her fill. And yet, she knew he'd come back for more, eager to serve her in any way she saw fit. The weeks turned into months, and Tim's life became a never-ending cycle of pain and pleasure. He'd lost track of the days, his existence defined by the whims of his mistress. Evelyn had become more inventive in her domination, each night bringing a new toy, a new way to claim him. And with each act, his love for her grew stronger, a twisted vine entwined around his very soul.